Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we travel back nearly 2,500 years to a narrow strip of rock and salt water where the fate of Greece will be decided by 300 men who already know they are going to die. Picture it. The cliffs rise sheer on one side, close enough to touch, and the sea laps cold and grey on the other, so close together that a loaded mule cart can barely pass through. The air smells of sulphur from hot springs bubbling somewhere nearby, which is exactly why the locals call this place the Hot Gates. And somewhere beyond the horizon, a Persian army so vast that ancient writers will lose their nerve, trying to count it, is already marching this way. Here's your reality check for the evening. If you were standing in that pass wearing bronze that weighed as much as a large dog holding a spear, a little taller than you are, staring down a horizon that was slowly filling with enemy, campfires, you would not last the afternoon. Most of us wouldn't. That's not an insult, it's just physics and terror working together. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I like knowing whereabouts in the world you're curled up while ancient Greece falls apart in the background. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. He stands at the edge of camp in the last grey light before dusk, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a beard gone, iron-coloured, and eyes that don't move much because there isn't much left in this world that surprise him. His name is Leonidas, and he is a king, though tonight he looks more like a mason checking the foundation of a house he already suspects will not stand. Around him 300 men are doing ordinary things, sharpening blades, oiling leather straps, laughing quietly at jokes you and I would probably find too dark for polite company. And here is what you have to understand about these men. Every single one of them has a son back home in Sparta. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should, and we'll come back to it. Leonidas didn't choose these 300 by strength or by speed or even by seniority. He chose them because they already have heirs. If Sparta is about to lose its finest soldiers, it cannot afford to lose its bloodlines along with them. It's a brutal kind of arithmetic, but Sparta has never pretended to be gentle. A raven crosses the darkening sky above the camp, and someone mutters that it's an omen, though nobody agrees on whether it's a good one or a bad one. Leonidas doesn't look up. He has heard something far more specific than a bird's flight path, and it is sitting in his chest like a stone he swallowed weeks ago and never quite digested. Before he left Sparta, he visited the temple of the oracle at Delphi, as any king preparing for war would. The priestess there, breathing whatever strange vapours rose from the cracks in the temple floor, gave Sparta a prophecy that split cleanly into two terrible halves. Either the city of Sparta itself would fall to the Persians, sacked and burned, its bloodlines scattered to the wind, or a king of the line of Heracles would have to die. Historians still argue about how literally the Spartans took prophecies like this one, whether it was genuine spiritual conviction or political theatre dressed up in incense smoke. But Leonidas, standing here at the edge of a war camp, with the sea hissing somewhere in the dark, seems to have made his peace with which half of that prophecy he intends to fulfill. He walks between the fires, and you notice if you're watching closely that he doesn't walk like a man marching toward his death. He walks like a man inspecting his own front door, making sure the hinges will hold one more winter. There is no drama in it. That more than anything is what should unsettle you. A young soldier, maybe 20 years old, catches his eye and straightens automatically the way soldiers do around kings. Leonidas nods once unhurried and keeps walking. Later historians will record something almost unbelievable about the men Leonidas selected for this mission. Several of them, it's said, were pulled aside individually and given quiet, private messages to carry home to their wives. Not military orders, personal words. A king making sure that if the worst happens, something soft still survives the wreckage. Somewhere out past the ridgeline, campfires are multiplying like sparks scattered across black cloth, and every hour there seem to be more of them. Word has already reached the Greek camp that the army marching toward this pass numbers in the hundreds of thousands, an incomprehensible tide of Persians, Medes, Egyptians, immortals in gold and crimson, all of it commanded by a king who has never once in his life been told no. Leonidas has heard the number 2. He does not react to it the way you might expect. He simply finishes his walk through camp, settles by his own fire, and begins sharpening a blade that by this time tomorrow may already have done its work. Somewhere far to the east, in a tent larger than most Greek houses, another king is finishing his own preparations, and his reasons for coming to this pass go back further than anyone in this Spartan camp fully understands. Before we return to Leonidas and his 300, we need to understand exactly who is coming for them, and why this particular Persian king has been dreaming of Greek blood for the better part of a decade. 10 years before this night, in a different pass, a different Persian king met a very different Greek army and lost badly enough that the wound never fully closed. That king was Darius, and the battlefield was a place called Marathon, where an outnumbered force of Athenians did something nobody expected and threw the Persian invasion back into the sea. Darius never forgave that defeat. He spent years afterward gathering resources for a second invasion, one massive enough to erase the humiliation entirely, but he died before he could launch it. And here is where the story pivots to the man whose army is now flooding toward the pass at Thermopylae like water finding every crack in a dam. Xerxes inherited his father's throne, and along with it he inherited his father's unfinished grudge. Picture him now, a tall man in his 30s, dressed in robes so heavily embroidered with gold thread that servants have to help him move in them, seated on a portable throne that his engineers carry from camp to camp like a piece of bais, furniture that happens to rule the known world. He has spent 4 full years preparing for this campaign. 4 years of stockpiling grain along the invasion route, 4 years of building bridges, 4 years of assembling what ancient writers will later claim is an army of over 2 million men, a number modern historians think is wildly exaggerated though. Even conservative estimates still land somewhere in the hundreds of thousands. Either way, you have to understand the sheer scale of what's coming. This isn't a raid. This is a moving nation. Here's a detail that tends to surprise people. To get his army across the strait, separating Asia from Europe, Xerxes ordered his engineers to build not 1 but 2 massive pontoon bridges made of hundreds of ships, lashed together side by side with planking laid across the top, so his army could march over open water as if it were solid ground. And when a storm destroyed the first attempt, Xerxes reportedly flew into such a rage that he ordered the sea itself to be whipped 300 times as punishment, and had shackles symbolically thrown into the water to chain it into obedience. Historians still debate whether this story is literal fact or later Greek propaganda designed to paint Xerxes as a man so arrogant he thought he could punish the ocean. Either way, it tells you something about how this king's mind works, and about how the Greeks wanted him remembered. And here's your dry little truth for the evening. Whipping the sea did not in fact make the sea behave any better. The second bridge held, though engineered with more care and more cable, and across it marched what may be the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever assembled. Before this army even reaches Greek soil, Xerxes sends messengers ahead to Greek cities demanding the traditional offering of submission, a gift of earth and water, a symbolic gesture meaning that a city acknowledges Persia as its master. Many smaller Greek city-states, terrified of what's coming, comply without hesitation. It's a reasonable choice, honestly. Nobody blames them, not really. Not when the alternative is watching your home burn to ash. But 2 cities refuse, Athens and Sparta, and you have to picture what happens next in Sparta specifically, because it's the kind of story that tells you everything about who these people are. When Xerxes' messengers arrive demanding earth and water, the Spartans don't debate policy or send back a carefully worded diplomatic refusal. Instead, according to the story passed down through the centuries, they simply throw the messengers into a well and tell them quite plainly that they'll find plenty of earth and water down there. It's brutal, it's a little bit funny in a grim way, and it's also a direct violation of the sacred rule, protecting diplomatic messengers, a rule so old and so universally respected across the ancient world that even enemies, usually honored it. The Spartans broke it anyway, and some accounts claim that afterward they felt genuinely uneasy about what they'd done, worried that the gods themselves might hold a grudge for the insult. Xerxes understandably does not forget this either. So now you have two kings, each carrying a decade or more of accumulated grievance, each convinced that history has appointed them to settle it. One commands an army so large that ancient writers claim it drank entire rivers dry as it passed. The other commands 300 men standing in a gap between a cliff and the sea, men whose own city couldn't even send its full army because of a religious festival that Spartan law absolutely will not allow them to interrupt. And that detail, strange as it sounds, is not some minor footnote. It's the reason Leonidas is standing at Thermopylae with a fraction of Sparta's true military strength instead of its full force. We need to understand exactly what kept an entire nation's army at home while its king marched north with a token force to meet the largest invasion the world had ever seen. Because the answer involves a sacred festival, an ancient law that even kings cannot override, and a desperate compromise that some historians believe Leonidas himself may have quietly engineered, choosing to march north immediately rather than wait for permission he suspected would never come in time. Whether that was loyalty to Sparta's laws, or a king finding a legal loophole to walk willingly toward the fate the oracle had already promised him, is something we're about to find out. Back in Sparta, in the weeks before Leonidas ever set foot on the road north, the city is caught in a bind that would be almost comedic if the stakes weren't so enormous. Because here's the thing about Sparta that people outside of it rarely understand. It isn't simply a military machine that snaps to attention the moment danger appears. It's also one of the most religiously rigid societies in the ancient Greek world, and right now, at the exact moment history needs its army most, that religious rigidity has become a cage. Picture the assembly hall packed with Spartan elders and magistrates, voices rising over one another because word has arrived that the largest army ever assembled is marching toward Greek soil and Sparta's full military strength, famous heavy infantry that other Greek cities fear even more than they fear Persia cannot leave the city. Not yet. Not for a little while longer. And the reason is a religious festival called the Carneia, held every year in honor of the god Apollo, a festival so sacred that Spartan law forbids military campaigns during its observance. Here's what makes this almost unbearable. If you're sitting in that assembly hall watching the calendar tick forward while Persian scouts are already being spotted in the hills to the north, the Carneia isn't a quiet, private little ceremony. It's an entire month of communal rites, athletic contests, and religious processions deeply woven into Spartan identity, tied to old agricultural cycles, and older still to the city's sense of divine favor. Break this law, and the Spartans genuinely believe they risk losing the protection of the gods themselves right at the moment they need it most. And here's your dry observation for tonight. You would think a city famous for producing the most disciplined soldiers in the ancient world could find some flexibility in its own religious calendar when annihilation is knocking at the door. Sparta characteristically does not see it that way. So a compromise is struck, and it's the kind of compromise that only makes sense once you understand how Spartan law actually works. The full army cannot march, but a smaller force, technically a royal bodyguard rather than an official campaign army, can be sent ahead under the personal command of one of Sparta's two kings as a stopgap, a delay, something to buy time until the religious restrictions lift and the true Spartan army can follow behind in full strength. This is where Leonidas steps forward, and it's worth pausing on how unusual this actually is. Sparta typically operates under a dual kingship, two royal houses ruling jointly, a system designed specifically to prevent any single man from accumulating too much unchecked power. But it's Leonidas who volunteers, or perhaps more accurately, Leonidas who insists that he lead this token force north immediately, rather than wait for the technicalities to resolve themselves. Some ancient sources suggest something quietly remarkable here, something that historians still debate today. Leonidas may have understood from the very beginning that this expedition was never truly meant to hold the pass against overwhelming numbers. It was meant to delay to buy Greece precious days, while the rest of the alliance mobilized and possibly, depending on how literally you take the Delphic prophecy, to serve as the sacrifice that prophecy had already demanded. A king of the line of Heracles would die, or Sparta itself would fall. If Leonidas believed that prophecy, and there's reason to think he did, then marching north with a deliberately small, expendable force wasn't recklessness. It was calculation dressed up as duty. And here's a detail that tends to catch people off guard when they first hear it. The 300 men Leonidas selects aren't chosen through some formal military lottery or by testing their combat skill against one another. Leonidas handpicks them personally, one by one, and the criteria he uses has almost nothing to do with who the strongest fighter is. We'll get into exactly how he made that selection in a moment, but for now, understand this. Every man Leonidas chooses already has a living son back in Sparta. That's not sentiment. That's Spartan pragmatism wearing the mask of sentiment. If this expedition ends in disaster, and Leonidas has every reason to suspect it will, Sparta cannot afford to lose entire bloodlines along with its soldiers. The city needs its warrior families to continue generation after generation, regardless of what happens in the mountains of central Greece. So as the assembly hall empties and the elders return to their preparations for the Carneia festival, completely unbothered, at least outwardly, by the fact that their king is about to march toward the largest army in human history with a fraction of Sparta's true strength, Leonidas begins the quiet, deliberate work of assembling his 300. He walks through barracks and training grounds, past men decades younger than himself, past veterans with scars from wars fought before some of these younger soldiers were even born, and he makes his choices with a stillness that unsettles the men watching him do it. Because there is something deeply strange about being selected for an honor that everyone in the room understands might actually be a death sentence. Nobody says that out loud, of course. Spartans don't talk about fear the way the rest of us might, but you can see it if you know where to look, in the way conversations pause slightly too long after Leonidas moves past. In the way wives back home will later describe their husbands' final nights before departure with a peculiar, deliberate calm. We're about to walk through exactly how Leonidas built his 300 man by man, and the strange, almost ritualistic logic behind who made the cut and who, despite desperately wanting to go, was quietly turned away. The training grounds outside Sparta are quiet in a way that feels unnatural for a city about to send men to war. No shouting drill masters today, no clash of practice swords, just Leonidas moving slowly between rows of soldiers, standing at something between attention and unease, because word has spread that the king is here to choose, and nobody yet knows exactly what he's choosing for. You have to understand something about Spartan society before this scene makes any sense. Every Spartan man of fighting age has spent his entire life training for exactly this moment, since roughly the age of 7, when boys were pulled from their families and enrolled in a brutal state education system called the agoge, designed to strip away softness and produce soldiers who could endure almost anything without complaint. By the time these men stand in front of Leonidas today, most of them have spent 30-40 years perfecting the same fundamental skill, holding a line. Not one of them lacks the physical qualification for this mission. Strength was never going to be the deciding factor. So Leonidas walks the rows, and here's the detail that still catches people off guard centuries later. He isn't asking about spear technique or shield discipline. He's asking quietly, man by man, whether they have sons. Not wives, not property. Sons. Living male heirs back home who can carry the family name forward regardless of what happens on this expedition. It's a strange kind of selection when you sit with it. Imagine standing in that line, a battle-hardened Spartan in the prime of your life, watching the king walk past you toward a man 20 years older, simply because that older man already has 3 sons at home, and you, despite your strength, have none yet. There's no negotiating with this logic. It isn't about who Leonidas thinks would fight hardest. It's about who Sparta can afford to lose. And here's a genuinely poignant detail from the ancient sources. Among the 300 selected, there's a pair of brothers, and their story illustrates exactly how seriously the Spartans took this bloodline calculation. When one of these men is initially left off, the list denied a place among the 300 despite desperately wanting to march north with his king. Ancient writers record that his response wasn't relief, it was devastation. Being excluded from this expedition wasn't experienced as a mercy. It was experienced by the men themselves as a kind of quiet dishonor, a sign that Sparta didn't consider you essential enough to preserve. Historians still argue about how much of this reaction is authentic Spartan cultural conditioning, and how much is later Greek storytellers polishing the myth of Spartan fearlessness into something almost too perfect to be entirely true. But even accounting for some exaggeration, the core detail holds up under scrutiny. These men wanted to go, not despite the danger. In a strange way, partly because of it. Here's your one touch of dry humor for this section, because even in the middle of assembling a suicide mission, there's something almost absurd about the logistics involved. Word spreads through the training grounds that being chosen requires having a son back home, and you can imagine somewhere in the barracks that night, more than one soldier doing some very rapid mental arithmetic about his personal life choices and deeply regretting whatever delays had kept him from starting a family sooner. Leonidas continues down the rows, and gradually a pattern emerges among the men he selects. They aren't the youngest, freshest soldiers Sparta has to offer. Many of them are veterans, well into middle-aged men who have already survived earlier campaigns. Men whose bodies carry the scars of decades of warfare. This wasn't sentimentality either. Older men with grown or nearly grown sons represented Sparta's most expendable military resource in the coldest possible sense, valuable enough to fight effectively, but not so young that their loss would rob the city of decades of future service and future children. And there's a detail buried in ancient accounts that deserves real attention because it complicates the neat heroic version of this story that gets repeated most often. Before departure, several of the chosen men are given private moments with Leonidas, and according to some ancient writers, more than one soldier receives an unusual, deeply personal request from his king. Rather than official military instructions, these men are asked to carry quiet, intimate messages home. Words meant for wives, for young children who might not fully understand yet what their fathers were marching toward. It's a small human detail, easy to lose inside the grand sweep of history, but it tells you something important. Leonidas wasn't simply organizing a military delaying action. He was preparing deliberately and consciously for the possibility, perhaps even the likelihood, that none of these men would return. By the time the selection finishes, 300 men stand assembled, and the mood among them is difficult to fully capture because it isn't grim resignation, at least not on the surface. It's something closer to pride, mixed uneasily with a kind of dark, private clarity. These men understand on some level that ancient sources suggest was rarely spoken aloud but was nonetheless deeply felt, that they have just been selected for something closer to a sacred obligation than a standard military campaign. As dawn approaches on the morning of departure, the 300 gather their gear, embrace what family members have come to see them off, and begin forming ranks for the road north. Behind them, Sparta continues its interrupted festival, bound by laws that even the threat of annihilation cannot override. Ahead of them lies a march through the heart of the Peloponnese, gathering allied soldiers from other Greek cities along the way, men whose loyalty, unlike Sparta's, has not been tested by centuries of rigid military tradition, and whose resolve, as we're about to see, will be tested in very different ways once the true scale of the Persian army becomes impossible to ignore. The road north out of Sparta is dry and pale under a hard sun winding up through hills where the grass has already gone, the color of old bone from the summer heat. Leonidas rides near the front of the column, and behind him the 300 move in that eerily precise Spartan marching rhythm. Spears resting against shoulders, red cloaks catching the wind in a way that from a distance makes the column look like something bleeding slowly across the landscape. Here's what you need to picture, though, because this isn't simply 300 Spartans marching alone into history. As the column moves north through the Peloponnese, it begins gathering strength city by city, the way a snowball gathers mass rolling downhill. Except this snowball is made of increasingly nervous soldiers from towns that have spent the last several weeks watching Persian scouts appear on their northern horizons. At Corinth, soldiers fall in alongside the Spartans' men whose loyalty has been secured through the Hellenic League, a defensive alliance hastily stitched together among Greek city-states that until quite recently spent as much time fighting each other as cooperating against outside threats. That detail alone tells you something remarkable about the moment. Greece, fractured and quarrelsome by nature, dozens of independent city-states with their own governments, their own grudges, their own gods and rivalries, has managed to set enough of that aside, at least temporarily, to face something that threatens to erase all of them equally. More soldiers joined from Tegea, from Mantinea, from Arcadia, small contingents trickling in from towns whose names most of us have never heard, whose soldiers have never fought alongside Spartans before, and are visibly uncertain about what that experience will actually be like. And here's your dry observation for tonight. Imagine being handed a spear, told to fall in line next to men whose reputation for brutal discipline borders on legend, and being expected to hold formation shoulder to shoulder with them as though you've trained together your entire life. Several ancient accounts suggest the early days of this march were less about combat readiness and more about painfully awkward logistics. Soldiers from different cities figuring out whose battle commands to follow, whose formations to mimic, whose Greek dialect to strain their ears to understand. By the time the combined force reaches its staging point, historians estimate its total strength somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 men, a number that sounds substantial until you remember exactly what's marching toward them from the opposite direction. This isn't an army capable of meeting Xerxes' forces in open battle. Everyone in that column knows it, even if nobody says it aloud around the campfires at night. And here's where the geography of Greece itself becomes quite literally this army's only real weapon. Leonidas and the other Greek commanders have chosen their destination carefully, and it's worth pausing on exactly why, because the choice reveals a level of strategic thinking that gets somewhat lost in the more famous, more dramatic parts of this story. Greece is a land defined by narrow mountain passes and jagged coastlines, terrain that naturally funnels large armies into tight defensible corridors. An enemy with overwhelming numerical superiority, like the one currently marching across the pontoon bridges from Asia, loses almost all of that advantage the moment it's forced to squeeze through a gap barely wide enough for a handful of men to fight shoulder to shoulder. There's actually been debate among the assembled Greek commanders about where exactly to make this stand. Some favored the Isthmus of Corinth, a narrow strip of land protecting the Peloponnese itself, arguing that defending closer to Spartan territory made more strategic sense. But that plan would have abandoned Athens and the rest of central Greece entirely to Persian conquest. A political and moral cost the alliance wasn't willing to pay, at least not yet. So the decision is made to march further north, to a pass along the coast where the mountains crowd almost directly into the sea. A place local shepherds and travellers have long called simply the Hot Gates, named for the sulphurous hot springs, bubbling up from the rock nearby. As the column presses onward, the mood shifts almost imperceptibly day by day. What began as a somewhat disorganized gathering of nervous city-state militias slowly hardens into something closer to a genuine fighting force, forged less by formal training, since there simply isn't time for that, and more by the shared, unspoken understanding of exactly what waits for tow them ahead. Campfire conversations grow quieter as the days pass. Soldiers who spoke freely in the first days of the march now spend more time checking their equipment, more time in private thought, less time joking with the men beside them. Leonidas, for his part, seems to grow more focused rather than more anxious as the distance to Thermopylae shrinks. Ancient writers describe him during this stretch of the march as calm, to the point of unsettling those around him, a man who has already in some private internal way made peace with whatever waits ahead. Whether that calm comes from genuine confidence in the defensive position they're marching toward, or from something closer to acceptance of the prophecy delivered back at Delphi, is something even the ancient sources can't fully agree on. By the final approach, word reaches the column that Persian scouts have already been spotted uncomfortably close to their destination, and for the first time the true scale of what's coming becomes impossible to ignore, even in rumor and second-hand report. Soon Leonidas will crest a final rise in the road and see for the first time with his own eyes the exact piece of ground he's chosen to make his stand upon, a narrow gap between stone and sea that will either save Greece or bury these men trying. The column crests the final rise, and Leonidas reins in for a long moment, simply looking. Below him, the land does something strange and specific, the kind of geography you don't fully appreciate until you're standing in front of it. To his right, the mountains of central Greece rise, almost vertically, grey stone streaked with scrub brush, climbing so steeply that no army, however massive, could realistically march an invading force over the top of them in any organized way. To his left, barely a stone's throw from the base of those cliffs, the sea laps against a narrow shoreline, close enough in places that a man could throw a spear from the mountain path and have it land in the water. And squeezed between those two immovable boundaries sits a passage so narrow that at its tightest point, ancient sources describe it as barely wide enough for a single cart to pass through. This is Thermopylae, the hot gates, named for the natural hot springs bubbling up from cracks in the rock nearby, sulphurous and steaming, filling the air with a faint rotten egg smell that, according to local legend, was once the bath water of the mythical hero Heracles himself, cooling his tired limbs after one of his labors. Here's what you need to picture to really understand why Leonidas chooses this exact spot. In open terrain, Persia's overwhelming numerical advantage would simply crush any Greek force through sheer weight, encircling smaller formations, exhausting them through repeated waves of fresh troops rotating in and out of combat. But here, in this stone corridor, none of that numerical advantage matters in the way it should. Only a small number of men can physically fit shoulder to shoulder in that gap at any given moment, meaning that no matter how many hundreds of thousands of soldiers Xerxes brings, only a handful can actually engage the Greek line at once. It's the kind of terrain that turns a battle into something closer to a bottleneck, and Leonidas, walking the pass on foot, now studying the exact width of the passage at its narrowest point, seems to understand immediately that this ground might do something remarkable. It might cancel out Persia's single greatest advantage entirely. There's an old stone wall running partway across the pass, built generations earlier by the Phocians, a local Greek people originally constructed to help defend against raids from a neighboring region. It's crumbling now, weathered by decades of disuse, but Leonidas orders his men to begin rebuilding and reinforcing it immediately, transforming old, half-forgotten stonework into a fresh defensive barrier. Soldiers spend the following hours hauling loose rock, stacking it higher, wedging it into gaps, turning an ancient ruin into something that might actually hold a line. And here's a detail that tends to surprise people who only know the more mythologized version of this story. Thermopylae isn't actually a single narrow gap. It's more accurately three separate choke points strung along the coastline, referred to by ancient writers as the West Gate, the Middle Gate, and the East Gate. Leonidas chooses to make his primary stand at the Middle Gate, the narrowest of the three, where the mountain and the sea press closest together, and where that old Phocian wall provides an existing foundation to build upon. Here's your dry observation for tonight. There's something almost architecturally satisfying about watching a king personally inspect a wall's stonework, the way a mason might running a hand along uneven stacked rock, testing its stability, while somewhere beyond the deeper horizon, an army large enough to drink rivers, dry, continues its slow, inexorable approach. It's an oddly domestic image to place beside the scale of what's coming. As the reinforcement work continues, Leonidas sends scouts further along the coastline and up into the surrounding hills, gathering as much information as possible about the terrain beyond what's immediately visible. And it's during this reconnaissance that a detail surfaces which will matter enormously later in this story, though right now it seems like little more than a minor administrative note. There exists a narrow mountain track, a rough goat path really winding up through the hills above the pass, and eventually rejoining the coast road further south, essentially offering a way to bypass the hot gates entirely by going up and over rather than through. Local Phocian soldiers familiar with this territory volunteer to guard that path, positioning themselves on the high ground to watch for any Persian attempt to use it. Leonidas accepts this arrangement, and for now it seems like a reasonable precaution rather than a critical vulnerability. We'll return to that mountain path later, because it's about to become one of the most consequential pieces of geography in the entire war. But for now, understand that Leonidas has done everything a commander in his position reasonably can. He has chosen ground that neutralizes Persia's greatest strength. He has reinforced an ancient wall into a fresh defensive line. He has posted watchers on the one alternate route he knows about. As dusk settles over the pass, that first evening campfires begin dotting the narrow strip of land between cliff and sea smoke, mixing with the faint sulfur smell rising from the hot springs. Leonidas stands near the reinforced wall looking south down the coast road, toward where any day now the vanguard of the largest army in the ancient world will finally come into view. And somewhere out in the darkness, beyond the visible horizon, that vanguard is already closer than anyone in the Greek camp realizes, close enough that within a day or two, a Persian scout will creep near enough to this very camp to see something that will leave him thoroughly confused about exactly what kind of enemy Xerxes is about to face. The night is thick and close along the coast road, the kind of darkness where sound carries strangely, where a dropped shield or a nervous cough travels much further than it should. Somewhere out beyond the flickering ring of Greek campfires, a single rider moves carefully through scrub brush and loose stone, dismounting well before he gets close enough to be spotted, continuing on foot with the particular deliberate quiet of a man who has done this kind of work before. He is a Persian scout sent ahead by Xerxes to assess exactly what kind of resistance is waiting in this narrow pass before the main army commits to an attack. And what he sees when he finally gets close enough to the Greek camp to make out details in the firelight is going to leave him thoroughly, almost comically confused. Picture it through his eyes for a moment. He's expecting reasonably to see an armed camp bracing for imminent battle. Soldiers sharpening weapons, officers barking orders, the tense, watchful energy of men who understand that an enormous invading force is closing in on their position within days, possibly hours. Instead, what he actually observes is a group of Spartan soldiers, some of them stripped down and exercising in the open, doing what ancient sources describe as calisthenics and stretching routines, while others sit calmly combing and arranging their long hair. That last detail deserves a moment of context, because to modern ears it sounds almost absurd, and honestly, it sounded almost absurd to the Persian scout too. Spartan men traditionally wore their hair long, and there was a specific cultural significance attached to grooming it carefully before battle. It wasn't vanity in the way we might assume. Among Spartans, meticulously combing and arranging one's hair before combat was considered a way of preparing psychologically and symbolically for what was coming, a ritual of composure in the face of death rather than an act of self-regard. But the scout watching from a distance doesn't know any of that cultural context. All he sees is an army supposedly facing annihilation within days, that appears to be more concerned with personal grooming than military readiness. He returns to Xerxes' camp and reports exactly what he witnessed, and here's your dry observation for the evening. It's genuinely hard to imagine a more confusing intelligence report to deliver to the king of the largest army in the ancient world. Somewhere in that grand crimson command tent, Xerxes listens to a description of enemy soldiers doing stretching exercises and hairstyling instead of fortifying their position or fleeing in terror, and understandably none of it makes sense to him. Fortunately for Xerxes, there happens to be someone in his camp who can actually explain it. His name is Demaratus, and his presence here is one of the stranger, more human details buried inside this entire story. Demaratus was once a king of Sparta himself, one of the two royal lines that traditionally rule the city jointly, before internal political rivalries and accusations of illegitimate birth forced him into exile years earlier. Rather than disappearing into obscurity, he made his way to the Persian court where Xerxes has kept him close, partly as a valuable source of insider knowledge about exactly how Spartans think and fight. When Xerxes describes what his scout witnessed, expecting Demaratus to help him make sense of what seems like bizarre, almost negligent behavior from an enemy army, Demaratus offers an answer that Xerxes visibly struggles to accept. He explains that this behavior isn't negligence at all. It's ritual. Spartans traditionally groom their hair with particular care, specifically before engagements, where they expect to fight to the death, treating the moment almost like a sacred preparation rather than an ordinary pre-battle routine. Demaratus tells Xerxes plainly that these men have no intention of retreating, that they intend to hold this pass regardless of how many soldiers Xerxes sends against them, and that Xerxes should expect a fight unlike anything his army has previously encountered. And here's what makes this exchange so genuinely fascinating, historically speaking. Xerxes doesn't believe him. Ancient sources record that the Persian king laughed off this warning, dismissing it as either exaggeration or the bitter wounded pride of an exiled king trying to make his former countrymen sound more impressive than they actually are. It's an understandable reaction in a way. Xerxes commands an army so vast that ancient writers claim it took days for the entire force to simply cross the pontoon bridges into Europe. The idea that a few hundred men, however disciplined, could meaningfully delay that army probably sounds, from where Xerxes is sitting, less like a serious military assessment and more like wounded national pride talking. So, instead of adjusting his strategy based on Demaratus's warning, Xerxes decides on a different approach entirely. Rather than launching an immediate assault against this strange, unbothered little army blocking his path, he chooses to wait. Patience, he reasons, will accomplish what intimidation alone hasn't. Undeniable scale of the Persian army, now gathering just beyond the pass, these Greeks will lose their nerve and scatter on their own, sparing him the cost and delay of a direct assault altogether. It's a decision that will cost him 4 full days, 4 days, that Leonidas and his men will use in ways Xerxes almost certainly did not anticipate. 4 days that will only deepen the confusion and eventually the fury building steadily inside that grand crimson command tent as the Spartans stubbornly, infuriatingly refuse to do the one thing Xerxes is absolutely certain they will do. The days that follow settle into a strange, tense rhythm, the kind of waiting that feels heavier than actual combat because both sides know exactly what's coming and neither one is willing to be the first to blink. Xerxes camped just beyond the pass, with an army so enormous that later writers will claim its supply trains stretched for miles. Behind it holds his forces back, still convinced that patience alone will do the work that intimidation has so far failed to accomplish. And here's what you need to picture happening on the Greek side during these 4 days, because it's almost the opposite of what Xerxes is expecting. Rather than using the delay to panic, to argue among themselves, to quietly slip away under cover of darkness, the way Xerxes seems genuinely certain the Spartans do something that from a distance must have looked almost insulting in its casualness. They train. Leonidas has his men run through combat drills each morning in the open ground in front of their defensive position, spearwork shield formations, the tight, coordinated movements of the phalanx that Spartan soldiers have spent their entire lives perfecting. It's not simply practical preparation, though. It certainly serves that purpose too. It's also quite deliberately a message. Every drill performed in plain sight of Persian scouts is a statement that says, without a single word being exchanged between the two camps, that these 300 men have absolutely no intention of running. Here's your dry observation for the evening, because there's something almost theatrical about it when you really sit with the image. Imagine commanding the largest army the ancient world has ever assembled, an army so vast it reportedly took a full week just to finish crossing into Europe. and watching a few hundred men calmly stretch and drill in front of you like you're an audience they haven't quite decided is worth taking seriously yet. Xerxes, according to ancient accounts, grows increasingly frustrated as these 4 days pass without the capitulation he expected. He sends additional scouts hoping for some sign of wavering morale, some indication that the Greek resolve is beginning to crack under the visible pressure of facing such overwhelming numbers. Instead, each report comes back essentially unchanged. The Spartans train, they eat, they rest. They show no visible signs of the fear that Xerxes, quite reasonably given the numbers involved, assumes should be paralyzing them. There's a genuinely revealing exchange recorded from around this period, whether entirely historical or partly embellished by later Greek writers, eager to celebrate Spartan defiance, that captures the tone of this standoff perfectly. Xerxes reportedly sends a message ahead to the Greek position, offering Leonidas a chance to avoid bloodshed entirely. Surrender your weapons. The message essentially demands, and no harm will come to your men. Leonidas's response, according to the ancient historian who recorded it, consists of exactly 2 words in the original Greek, a famously terse reply that roughly translates to "come and take them." It's blunt to the point of being almost rude, and it tells you everything you need to know about how seriously Leonidas is taking the possibility of a peaceful resolution to this standoff. Meanwhile, behind the Greek lines, the mood among the allied contingents from other city-states is notably more complicated than the composed, almost unbothered confidence radiating from the Spartan core. These are men from Corinth, from Tegea, from Thespiae, soldiers who haven't spent their entire lives training specifically for moments like this one. And as the true scale of the Persian army becomes increasingly visible along the horizon, some of that earlier resolve begins, understandably, to waver. Ancient sources suggest quiet debates unfolding around campfires during these 4 days, Allied soldiers questioning whether this position can genuinely be held, whether staying represents courage or simply a slower, more organized form of suicide. Leonidas, for his part, seems entirely unmoved by any of this uncertainty rippling through the Allied ranks. He continues drilling his 300 each morning with the same unhurried discipline, and there's something almost hypnotic, if you can picture it clearly enough, about watching a small, doomed army maintain perfect formation and rhythm while an incomprehensibly larger force gathers on the horizon waiting. By the 4th day, Xerxes has clearly run out of patience for waiting on Greek surrender that shows no sign of ever coming. Ancient writers record his mounting fury at what he perceives as reckless, almost insulting stubbornness from an enemy force he still cannot quite bring himself to take seriously as a genuine military threat. Whatever calculations he's been running, hoping the Greeks would simply lose their nerve and scatter, have failed completely, and failed publicly, in front of an army whose confidence in their king's ability to swiftly crush this obstacle is presumably beginning to wear thin as bare. So on the 5th day, Xerxes finally abandons patience entirely and makes the decision that will transform this tense standoff into open warfare. He orders his regular infantry forward into the pass, expecting, one imagines, that sheer numbers alone will finally do what 4 days of intimidation and one very blunt 2-word reply failed to accomplish. What happens next is going to teach Xerxes, in the most direct and costly way possible, exactly what Demaratus had been trying to warn him about all along. The order finally comes down through the Persian ranks on the 5th morning, and the pass at Thermopylae, quiet and almost eerily still for 4 full days, erupts into motion. Xerxes has chosen to send in troops from the Medes and the Scythians first, soldiers drawn from regions long absorbed into the Persian Empire, brave and experienced by most standards, but about to encounter something that none of their previous battles have prepared them for. Picture the scene from above if you can, because the geography here does something almost cruel to the attacking side. The narrow gap between mountain and sea means that even though Xerxes commands an army large enough to blot out the horizon, only a tiny fraction of that force can actually engage the Greek line at any given moment. Row after row of Persian soldiers stack up behind the front lines, unable to do anything but wait their turn, while the men actually fighting find themselves crushed into a space barely wide enough for a market cart. The Greeks, meanwhile, have arranged themselves in the classic phalanx formation shields, overlapping edge to edge into a single, unbroken wall of bronze spear tips, bristling forward in tight, disciplined rows. And here is what you have to understand about this formation, because it's the entire reason this battle unfolds the way it does. A phalanx isn't really an assembly of individual fighters. It functions more like a single organism, each man's shield, protecting not only himself but the exposed side of the soldier beside him, creating a wall that simply doesn't have the kind of gaps and weak points that individual combat naturally produces. The Medes surge forward, shouting, weapons raised, expecting the kind of chaotic individual combat that has served Persian forces well against less disciplined opponents in previous campaigns. Instead, they slam directly into that wall of overlapping shields and immediately discover that their preferred fighting style, built around mobility, ranged weapons and overwhelming numbers, simply doesn't function in a space this cramped. There's no room to maneuver. There's no way to flank a formation that has both its sides protected by unforgiving natural terrain. There is only the brutal grinding business of trying to push through a wall of bronze and spear points that refuses to yield. Here's a mainstream historical fact worth sitting with for a moment, because it captures just how one-sided this initial clash actually was. Ancient sources describe Persian casualties in these opening engagements as severe, disproportionately so, given that the two forces were on paper nowhere near evenly matched in overall numbers. The Spartan-led phalanx, fighting from a fixed, narrow position with both flanks naturally protected, simply outclasses the attacking Medes in a way that has almost nothing to do with individual bravery and everything to do with formation discipline and terrain working together like a perfectly tuned machine. And here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that tends to surprise people once they hear it. The Spartans, according to several ancient accounts, employ a tactic during these opening waves that seems almost casually theatrical in its confidence. At certain points during the fighting, the Greek line deliberately feigns retreat, appearing to break formation and flee backward in apparent panic, only to suddenly reverse and turn on the pursuing Persians, once they've broken their own formation, chasing what they believed was a fleeing, defeated enemy. We'll come back to this tactic in more detail shortly, because it's about to become one of the single most devastating tricks in this entire battle. But even in these earliest engagements, it demonstrates something important about how thoroughly in control of the fighting the Spartans actually are, despite being outnumbered by a margin that should, by any conventional military logic, make control impossible. Watching from a raised platform positioned to give him a clear view of the pass, Xerxes observes all of this personally, and ancient sources describe his reaction in surprisingly vivid terms. He is not simply disappointed. Several accounts claim he leaps to his feet multiple times during the fighting, visibly agitated, watching wave after wave of his soldiers fail to make any meaningful progress against a defensive line that, from his vantage point, should logically have been overwhelmed within minutes by sheer weight of numbers alone. Here's your moment of dry observation for tonight, because there's something almost darkly comic about the mismatch in expectations playing out below that platform. Xerxes has spent 4 years and untold resources assembling what he genuinely believes to be an unstoppable force. And here, in the very first real engagement of the campaign, that force is being stopped repeatedly by soldiers who barely amount to a rounding error in his total troop count. By the time the Medes and Sicilians are finally pulled back from the fighting, exhausted and badly depleted, the pass at Thermopylae is littered with Persian dead in numbers that seem almost impossible, given how few Greek casualties the defenders have actually suffered in return. It's a humiliating opening result for Xerxes, and it forces him into a decision that up until this point he had presumably hoped to avoid. If his regular infantry cannot break this line, there is only one force left in his enormous army, with a reputation formidable enough to potentially do what the Medes and Sicilians just failed to accomplish. It's time to commit the immortals. By late afternoon, with the pass still choked with Persian dead and his regular infantry withdrawn in disarray, Xerxes makes the decision that ancient writers frame as a genuine turning point in the psychological weight of this battle. He orders forward his most elite fighting force, an elaborately equipped corps of 10,000 soldiers known throughout the ancient world as the Immortals. Here's what made the Immortals so formidable, and why sending them into the past represents Xerxes essentially playing his strongest card this early in the engagement. This wasn't simply an elite unit in the way modern armies might designate special forces. The Immortals maintained a fixed strength of exactly 10,000 men at all times. And here's the detail that gives them their name and their almost mythic reputation. Whenever a member of this unit died, fell too ill to fight, or was otherwise removed from the ranks, he was immediately replaced by a waiting reserve soldier, so that from a distance, the unit always appeared to remain at exactly its full strength, never visibly diminished, no matter how many individual soldiers within it had actually died. To Greek observers watching from a distance, it must have seemed almost supernatural, an army that never seemed to lose men no matter how brutal the fighting became. Picture them now marching forward into the pass with a discipline and uniformity that the earlier Medes and Scythians simply didn't display, dressed in scaled armor that caught the afternoon light, carrying wicker shields reinforced with metal, short spears and bows that had in previous campaigns, across the vast stretches of the Persian Empire, proven devastatingly effective against virtually every kind of opponent they'd faced. And here is what you have to understand watching this unfold from the Greek side of the wall. Leonidas and his men have been fighting continuously since morning, bodies exhausted, shields dented and cracked from hours of sustained combat, and now the single most feared and celebrated fighting force in the entire Persian Empire is marching directly toward their already battered line. The Immortals surge into the narrow gap with considerably more coordination than the earlier waves managed, and for a brief, tense stretch of fighting, it genuinely seems possible that this might be the moment the Greek line finally begins to buckle. Spears clash against shields in a rhythm that ancient writers describe almost like a terrible kind of music, metal against metal, punctuated by shouted commands and the low, awful sounds of men dying in a space too cramped for anyone to fully avoid the worst of it. But here's the mainstream historical fact that tends to genuinely surprise people once they understand exactly what's happening in this exchange. Despite their fearsome reputation across the rest of the Persian Empire, the Immortals fare essentially no better in this narrow pass than the regular infantry that preceded them. The terrain simply refuses to care about reputation. Their shorter spears, effective in the kind of open, flexible combat the Immortals were accustomed to across dozens of previous campaigns, put them at a direct physical disadvantage against the significantly longer Greek spears reaching out from behind that unbroken wall of overlapping shields. Their wicker-reinforced shields, lighter and more mobile than Greek bronze, simply cannot match the sheer defensive density of the Spartan phalanx in a fight this compressed and directly frontal. Here's your dry observation for the evening, because there's something almost poetic in how thoroughly geography humbles reputation in this moment. 10,000 men, whose very name was built around the idea of being unstoppable, replaced instantly whenever one fell, so that the unit itself seemed to defy death, are being stopped cold, not by superior numbers, not by some clever trap, but simply by a few hundred exhausted Greeks standing in exactly the right spot on the map. Watching from his platform, Xerxes reportedly grows even more visibly distressed than during the earlier engagement with the Medes. Ancient sources suggest that his agitation during this specific phase of the fighting became something close to alarm, watching his most trusted, most celebrated soldiers fail to accomplish what he had genuinely expected to be a swift, almost formality-level resolution to this entire standoff. The fighting grinds on into the fading afternoon light, and slowly the Immortals begin to withdraw, pulled back in a controlled retreat, rather than the outright rout suffered by the earlier waves, but a retreat nonetheless, one that leaves Persian dead scattered thick across the narrow strip of ground between the mountain and the sea. For the second time in a single day, Xerxes' army has thrown its strength directly against this impossibly small Greek force and come away having accomplished nothing except mounting casualties and a steadily growing, deeply uncomfortable question that must now be settling over the entire Persian command. If neither the regular infantry nor the legendary immortals can break this line through direct assault, what exactly is it going to take? And it's here, as the light fades over the pass and both sides withdraw to tend their wounded and bury or burn their dead, that we need to look more closely at exactly how the Greeks pulled off something during these engagements that goes beyond simple defensive discipline. Because tucked inside these first two waves of fighting is a specific tactical maneuver deceptively simple, devastatingly effective, that the Spartans used to turn Persian aggression directly against itself. To understand exactly what the Spartans did during those two brutal engagements, you have to set aside for a moment the image of a phalanx as something purely static, a wall that simply stands and absorbs punishment until the attacking force exhausts itself. That image is accurate in the broadest sense, but it misses something crucial about how Leonidas actually used this formation, something that turned out to be one of the most devastating pieces of battlefield deception in the entire war. Picture the fighting at its peak, the Medes or the Immortals pressing hard against the Greek line shields, locked spears jabbing in that grim, exhausting rhythm of close combat, and then, seemingly without warning, sections of the Spartan line begin to give ground. Not the whole formation collapsing into chaos, but a controlled, deliberate pulling back, shields angling away. The line appearing to buckle exactly the way an exhausted, overwhelmed defensive force might be expected to buckle after hours of relentless pressure. To the Persian soldiers pushing forward, exhausted themselves and desperate for any sign that their sheer numbers are finally accomplishing something, this must have looked like exactly the breakthrough they'd been straining toward all day. And here's what you have to understand about human psychology in the middle of violent, close-quarters combat. When an enemy line appears to break, the instinctive, almost uncontrollable response is to surge forward, to press the advantage, to chase what looks like a fleeing, defeated opponent before they can regroup. That instinct is exactly what gets weaponized against them, because the Spartan retreat isn't real, it's bait. And the moment pursuing Persian soldiers break their own tight formation to chase what they believe is a collapsing enemy, they lose the one thing that was actually keeping them relatively safe in this narrow, brutal terrain, which is coordinated, disciplined spacing between fighters. Individual Persian soldiers, suddenly strung out and disorganized in their eagerness to close the gap on a fleeing enemy, find themselves rushing into a space where the Greek formation abruptly reverses shields, snapping back into tight formation, spears leveling with brutal practiced precision against an enemy that has just made themselves catastrophically vulnerable. Here's the mainstream historical fact that anchors this tactic in something more than legend. Ancient historians, including Herodotus, whose account remains the primary source for most of what we know about this battle, specifically describe this feigned retreat as a deliberate, repeated tactic used by the Spartans throughout the day's fighting, not a lucky accident that happened once, but a calculated maneuver executed with enough discipline and coordination that it worked reliably against multiple waves of attackers who understandably had no way of knowing this particular Greek force would be sophisticated enough to fake weakness this convincingly. And here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that makes this tactic even more impressive once you sit with it. Executing a controlled false retreat under the immense psychological and physical strain of active combat requires an almost unbelievable level of collective discipline. Individual soldiers, exhausted, adrenaline flooding their systems, surrounded by the chaos and noise of men dying around them, have to trust completely that the retreat is coordinated, that their fellow soldiers beside them are pulling back in unison rather than genuinely breaking and fleeing, and that the entire formation will reverse together on cue rather than dissolving into the kind of real panicked rout that this maneuver so convincingly mimics. This isn't something you can teach soldiers in a few days of hurried preparation before a battle. This is a tactic that only works because these men have spent literal decades training together, moving together, trusting each other's instincts in formation so completely that even under the extreme stress of facing an army this size, they can execute something this precise without it collapsing into genuine chaos. Here's your dry observation for tonight, because there's a certain grim irony worth noting in how this tactic actually functions. The very quality that makes Xerxes' army so intimidating on paper, its overwhelming size, becomes a direct liability in moments like this. An army large enough to seem unstoppable is also necessarily an army made up of countless individual soldiers, each making split-second decisions under pressure, and it only takes a portion of those soldiers breaking formation in pursuit of what looks like an easy kill to create the kind of vulnerability that a smaller, more cohesive force can exploit with brutal efficiency. By the time both major waves of attack have been repelled, first the regular infantry, then the vaunted immortals themselves, this feigned retreat tactic has claimed a disproportionate share of Persian casualties. Soldiers cut down, not during the grinding, evenly matched press of frontal combat, but in the chaotic, vulnerable moments immediately after they broke formation, chasing an enemy that was never actually retreating at all. As night falls over the pass, both sides withdraw to assess the staggering cost of this single day of fighting, and the mood in the Persian camp has shifted from confident anticipation into something considerably more uneasy. Xerxes retreats to his command tent, having watched two of his best forces fail repeatedly against an enemy a fraction of their size. And somewhere in that uneasy Persian camp that night, a conversation is about to take place that will change the entire trajectory of this battle, involving a local man whose name history will remember for all the wrong reasons. Somewhere beyond the edges of the main Persian camp in the gathering dark of that same difficult night, a local man makes his way toward the Persian lines, and history is about to attach his name permanently to one of the ugliest words in the Greek language. His name is Ephialtes, and by morning he will have handed Xerxes the single piece of information capable of undoing everything Leonidas and his men accomplished that brutal first day of fighting. Here's what you need to understand about who Ephialtes actually was, because the popular version of this story tends to flatten him into something closer to a cartoon villain, when the reality, as historians still debate, is considerably murkier. He was a local man from the region surrounding Thermopylae itself, someone who knew this landscape intimately, who had likely walked these hills and mountain paths since childhood in ways that no outsider Greek or Persian ever could. And it's exactly that intimate local knowledge that he now offers to Xerxes in exchange for a reward that ancient sources suggest was substantial. The information itself concerns a detail we touched on earlier, back when Leonidas first arrived at Thermopylae and began fortifying his position. Remember that narrow mountain track, the rough goat path that Phocian soldiers had been posted to guard, winding up through the hills above the pass before eventually rejoining the coast road further south. Ephialtes knows this path intimately, knows exactly where it begins, exactly where it leads, and exactly how a determined force might use it to completely bypass the hot gates and emerge behind the Greek position entirely undetected. Here's the mainstream historical fact worth sitting with, because it's the pivot point on which this entire battle turns. According to Herodotus, whose account remains our primary window into these events, Ephialtes approaches the Persian camp, specifically motivated by the promise of a reward, betraying this critical piece of local geography purely for financial gain rather than any deeper political or personal grievance against Leonidas or the Greek cause more broadly. It's a strikingly simple, almost mundane motivation sitting at the center of what becomes one of history's most consequential betrayals. Not ideology, not revenge for some specific wrong, just money. And here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that historians still genuinely debate today, because the ancient sources themselves aren't entirely consistent on this point. Some later Greek writers offer alternative explanations for Ephialtes' betrayal, suggesting personal grievances or even physical deformity that had excluded him from serving among the ranks of Greek soldiers himself. theories that modern historians largely treat with skepticism, since they read suspiciously like the kind of moralizing embellishment ancient storytellers often added to make a villain's betrayal feel more narratively satisfying, tying an ugly action to an ugly physical trait in a way that tells you more about ancient prejudices than about Ephialtes' actual motivations. Whatever the precise truth of his reasoning, and we may never fully know it, Xerxes receives this information with what can only be described as tremendous relief. Here, finally, after a full day of watching his best forces fail repeatedly against a defensive line that should have been overwhelmed within minutes, is a path forward that doesn't require another costly frontal assault against that impossibly stubborn Greek phalanx. Here's your dry observation for tonight, because there's something almost darkly comic about the scale of the imbalance involved. An army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, backed by the resources of the largest empire the world has yet seen, has just spent an entire brutal day failing to dislodge a few hundred exhausted Greeks from a narrow strip of rock, and the solution, when it finally arrives, comes not from superior tactics or overwhelming force, but from a single local man walking into camp with knowledge of a hiking trail. Xerxes moves quickly once Ephialtes lays out the details of the path. He selects a substantial detachment of immortals, the same elite force that had failed so completely in the direct frontal assault earlier that day, and orders them to depart under cover of darkness, guided personally by Ephialtes along the mountain track with instructions to march through the night and emerge by morning, directly behind the Greek position at Thermopylae. It's worth pausing here on the sheer physical difficulty of what's being asked of these soldiers. This isn't a leisurely daytime hike along a well-marked trail. This is a night march along an unfamiliar, difficult mountain path through oak forest and loose screemen in heavy armor, navigating terrain they've never seen before, guided only by a local stranger and whatever moonlight filters down through the trees. Ancient sources describe the going as slow and treacherous, the kind of march that would exhaust even elite soldiers well before they reach their objective. As this detachment begins its difficult ascent into the darkened hills above the pass, the Greek camp below settles into an uneasy rest, soldiers tending wounds, repairing damaged equipment, and grappling with the exhausting aftermath of a day that, despite the staggering Persian casualties, has cost the defenders dearly as well. Nobody in that camp yet knows that somewhere above them, in the darkness of those steep forested hills, 10,000 immortals are already climbing toward a mountain path that Leonidas had hoped, perhaps too optimistically, would never become relevant to this battle at all. The mountain track that Ephialtes leads the immortals along is nothing like the wide, paved roads Persian armies are accustomed to marching across the flatter stretches of their empire. It winds upward through dense oak forest, the ground uneven and studded with loose stone that shifts underfoot with every step. The kind of terrain that punishes carelessness and rewards nothing but slow, deliberate caution. Picture the column moving through this. Darkness torches, largely extinguished or shielded, to avoid drawing attention. 10,000 soldiers in full armor, navigating a path that in daylight would already be a demanding climb for an unburdened traveler. The oak leaves overhead block much of what little moonlight there is, and ancient accounts describe the soldiers moving in tents near silence, aware that noise carries strangely in mountain terrain, and that discovery at this stage would completely unravel Xerxes' plan before it even had a chance to succeed. Here's what you need to understand about why this particular path exists at all, and why it was even a viable route in the first place. This region of Greece is riddled with exactly this kind of terrain, mountains that seem impassable at first glance, but that generations of local shepherds, hunters, and traders have slowly mapped out through centuries of practical necessity, carving in formal routes between valleys that outsiders would never think to look for. Ephialtes isn't discovering something new here. He's simply the one person willing to share knowledge that local families had likely passed down for generations, knowledge that until this specific night, the climb takes hours, and ancient sources suggest the pace was grueling, even for soldiers as experienced and physically capable as the immortals. Full armor weapons, the general exhaustion of men who had already fought a brutal failed engagement earlier that same day. All of it compounds against them as they push upward through terrain, never designed to accommodate an army this size moving with any real speed. Here's a detail that deserves particular attention because it illustrates something important about the fragility of secrecy in a plan like this one. This mountain path isn't entirely unguarded. Remember Leonidas, when first fortifying his position at Thermopylae, had specifically anticipated the possibility that an alternate route around the pass might exist, and had arranged for a contingent of Phocian soldiers, roughly 1,000 men according to most ancient accounts, to camp on the high ground specifically to watch for exactly this kind of flanking maneuver. So the plan isn't undiscovered. It's simply a race now, a question of whether the immortals can complete their difficult night march and descend behind the Greek position before that Phocian watch manages to raise a meaningful alarm, or whether the defenders posted on that ridge will detect the approaching force in time to genuinely disrupt what Xerxes has set in motion. As dawn begins to lighten the eastern sky, the immortals, guided the entire way by Ephialtes, finally near the top of the ridge, where the Phocian contingent has made its camp. And here's the mainstream historical fact that captures just how close this entire flanking maneuver came to being discovered too late to matter, or alternatively, discovered just early enough to genuinely change the outcome of what happens next. According to Herodotus, the Phocians become aware of the approaching immortals not through any dramatic scouting effort, but through something almost embarrassingly simple. The rustling sound of the Persian force moving through fallen oak leaves covering the forest floor gives away their approach in the final stretch before contact, the dry, brittle leaves crunching underfoot in the still morning air loud, enough to alert soldiers who had been camped nearby, unaware, until that moment that any enemy force was anywhere near their position. Here's your dry observation for tonight, because there's something almost fitting about the mismatch in scale playing out one more time in this story. An empire capable of building bridges across open sea, capable of assembling an invasion force so large it reportedly drank rivers dry, very nearly has its most consequential tactical maneuver of the entire war undone by something as mundane and unglamorous as a pile of dead leaves. The Phocians scramble to arm themselves, genuinely caught off guard by how close the Persian force has already come before being detected. And what happens in the confused, hurried minutes that follow is going to determine something enormously consequential, not whether the flanking maneuver succeeds, because by this point, with dawn breaking and the immortals already this close, that outcome feels increasingly inevitable. But whether word of this approaching force reaches Leonidas and the rest of the Greek army back at the pass in time to matter at all. The Phocians scramble up from their camp in a rush of confused motion, grabbing weapons and armor in the grey half-light of early dawn. And what follows is less an organized defensive stand and more a brief chaotic collision between two forces that neither one had fully expected to meet at this exact moment in this exact place. Here's what you need to understand about the Phocians' position in this specific engagement, because it explains a great deal about what happens next and why. They had been posted on this ridge specifically to watch for exactly this kind of flanking maneuver, but watching for a threat in the abstract and actually confronting 10,000 of Persia's most elite soldiers, appearing suddenly out of the forest at dawn, are two very different experiences. The immortals, for their part, are somewhat startled as well. Their entire mission depended on stealth, on slipping through this high mountain terrain, undetected and descending behind the Greek position before anyone below realized what was happening. Stumbling into an armed Greek contingent wasn't part of Ephialtes' plan, and for a brief, uncertain moment, both sides seemed genuinely unsure of exactly how this unexpected encounter is supposed to unfold. The Persian commander, leading this detachment, faced with an armed force blocking part of the ridge, makes a decision that ancient sources describe as almost startlingly pragmatic, given the stakes involved. Rather than committing his forces to a full, potentially costly engagement against the Phocians, which would slow the entire mission and risk exactly the kind of prolonged fighting that might allow word to reach Leonidas, with time to spare, he instead orders his archers to loose a heavy volley of arrows toward the Phocian position, enough to force them backward, to scatter them off the open ridge, and up toward higher, more defensible ground, where they pose considerably less immediate threat to the main column's continued advance. It works. The Phocians, caught off guard and facing what appears to be the leading edge of a vastly larger force than they're prepared to fight alone, retreat up the slope, taking a defensive position on higher ground and bracing for what they assume will be a full assault. But here's the detail that reveals just how narrowly focused this entire Persian maneuver actually is, and how little Xerxes cares about the Phocians specifically as a target. That assault never comes. The Immortals, having successfully pushed the Phocian force out of their direct path, simply continue moving past them, descending the far side of the ridge, resuming their march toward the coast road behind the Greek position at Thermopylae. The Phocians were never actually the objective. They were simply an obstacle to be shoved aside as quickly as possible, and once shoved aside, entirely irrelevant to the mission Ephialtes had promised Xerxes he could deliver. Here's the mainstream historical fact that matters most from this entire confused encounter. Despite the brief chaos and genuine uncertainty of those opening minutes, at least some of the Phocian soldiers manage in the aftermath of the skirmish to grasp the true scale and direction of what they've just witnessed, and immediately send runners racing down from the ridge toward the main Greek camp at the pass, carrying word that a substantial Persian force has successfully bypassed the mountain path and is now moving to outflank Leonidas's position entirely. Here's your dry observation for tonight, because there's a certain grim efficiency to how quickly this entire encounter resolves itself. An engagement that could have become a desperate, prolonged battle for control of a critical mountain path instead lasts only minutes, decided essentially by a single volley of arrows and a Persian commander's clear-eyed understanding that speed mattered infinitely more than a decisive victory over a secondary target that was never actually the point. The runners move quickly, but the terrain works against them, just as it worked against the Immortals climbing in the opposite direction hours earlier, steep and uneven ground slowing their descent, even as urgency drives them forward. Every minute that passes now matters enormously, because down at the pass, Leonidas and his exhausted men are just beginning to stir after a difficult night's rest, unaware that a force of Persia's most elite soldiers has already slipped past their carefully chosen defensive position and is now descending toward the coast road that leads directly to their rear. By the time word finally reaches the Greek camp, breathless and urgent, delivered by runners who have pushed themselves to the absolute limit of what the terrain allows, Leonidas is faced with a decision that will define everything that follows, a decision that has to be made quickly, with incomplete information, and with the full understanding that whatever choice he makes in these next few critical minutes will determine not just his own fate, but the fate of every allied soldier currently camped alongside him at the hot gates. The runners arrive at the Greek camp breathless, half stumbling down the last stretch of slope, and word spreads through the ranks with the particular kind of speed that only genuinely terrible news seems to carry. Leonidas gathers the Greek captains, quickly pulling commanders from Corinth, from Thespiae, from Thebes, and the smaller allied contingents into a hurried council, because there is no luxury of time here for lengthy deliberation. The mountain path has been compromised. A substantial Persian force, guided by local betrayal, is already descending toward the coast road behind them. Within hours, possibly less, the Greek position at Thermopylae will be caught between two Persian forces at once, the main army pressing from the front and the flanking Immortals closing in from behind. Here's what you need to understand about the geometry of this problem, because it explains exactly why the decision facing Leonidas in these compressed, urgent minutes is so brutally clear-eyed. The entire strategic value of Thermopylae, the reason this narrow pass had neutralized Persia's overwhelming numbers so effectively for a full day of fighting, depended entirely on the Greeks controlling both approaches to the gap, the frontal assault route, and that mountain track above it. The moment the Persians control the mountain path as well, that advantage doesn't simply diminish. It collapses entirely. A defensive position that can be surrounded on both sides stops being a defensive position at all. It becomes a trap. Leonidas, according to the ancient sources that record this council, moves through this realization with a clarity that several historians have noted feels almost unnervingly fast, as though the possibility of exactly this outcome had already have been turning somewhere in the back of his mind since a moment he first heard about that mountain path days earlier. He makes a decision, and it's worth sitting with exactly what that decision involves, because it reveals something important about the difference between blind heroism and calculated sacrifice. He orders the bulk of the allied Greek army, the soldiers from the various city-states who had joined this expedition, to withdraw immediately, to retreat south away from the pass before the Persian pincer closes completely and traps the entire combined force between two unstoppable fronts. Here's the mainstream historical fact that anchors this moment, and it's one that genuinely surprised many people who only know the more mythologized version of this story, where every single defender fights to the death. The majority of the Greek force at Thermopylae does in fact retreat on Leonidas's order, and this wasn't cowardice, nor was it framed as such by ancient writers. It was a deliberate tactical decision made by Leonidas himself to preserve the bulk of Greece's combined military strength for battles still to come, rather than allow the entire alliance's fighting force to be needlessly annihilated in a position that had within the space of a single night become strategically indefensible. And here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that complicates the neat, simple version of this decision even further. Not everyone leaves. Along with Leonidas's 300 Spartans, a contingent of roughly 700 soldiers from the city of Thespiae chooses, according to Herodotus, to remain and fight alongside the Spartans rather than retreat with the rest of the Rota army. Their reasoning, as recorded by ancient sources, wasn't rooted in some grand strategic calculation. It appears to have been something closer to simple, stubborn solidarity, a refusal to abandon allies who had chosen to stay and die rather than retreat to safety. There's also a smaller detail historians still debate regarding a contingent of soldiers from Thebes who, according to some accounts, remained at Thermopylae as well, though under circumstances that ancient writers describe quite differently depending on which source you consult, with some suggesting they were essentially held as hostages by Leonidas to guarantee Theban loyalty to the wider Greek alliance. Given that Thebes's political sympathies toward Persia were considered suspect by other Greek city-states at the time, whether that's entirely accurate or a later embellishment reflecting Greek political rivalries that outlasted the war itself, is something the ancient sources don't fully resolve. Here's your dry observation for tonight, and it's a small one, offered gently because the weight of this moment doesn't leave much room for anything heavier. There is something almost unbearably practical about watching a commander calmly organize an evacuation in the final hours before his own certain death, prioritizing the survival of an alliance over the survival of himself, as though the two things had never really been in competition in his mind at all. As the bulk of the Greek army begins its withdrawal south along the coast road, moving quickly to put distance between themselves and the closing Persian pincer, Leonidas turns back toward the pass, toward the roughly 1,500 men, 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians, and whatever remains of the Theban contingent who are staying behind. Dawn is close now, the sky beginning to lighten over the sea, and somewhere in those final quiet minutes before the fighting resumes, Leonidas delivers a line to his remaining soldiers that history will remember as one of the most darkly memorable moments of the entire war, a joke so grim and so perfectly timed that it somehow manages to steady the nerves of men who all understand with complete clarity now that they are not going to survive what comes next. The sky over the pass is beginning to lighten from black to a deep bruised blue, and the men who remain, roughly 1,500 of them now, instead of the several thousand who camped here just a day earlier, move through the last quiet preparations before what everyone in this camp understands will be the final engagement of their lives. There's no more talk of holding the pass indefinitely, no more discussion of delaying tactics or reinforcements arriving in time. The strategic calculation has shifted entirely, and Leonidas, moving among his remaining soldiers in these final hours, seems to understand exactly what kind of fight this has now become. Here's what you need to understand about why Leonidas chooses to stay at all, because it's worth pausing on this before the fighting resumes. He could have retreated with the rest of the army. Nobody watching from history would have called it cowardice, given that he had just ordered the bulk of the Greek force to do exactly that. But remember the prophecy delivered back at Delphi before this expedition ever began, the one insisting that either Sparta itself would fall or a king of the line of Heracles would have to die. Leonidas, according to most historians who study this period, appears to have made peace with fulfilling that second option a long time before this final morning ever arrived. Staying isn't recklessness. It's closer to something he had already decided quietly weeks earlier and simply hadn't spoken aloud until circumstances made it unavoidable. And here is where one of the most famous exchanges in all of ancient history takes place. Small, almost throwaway in the moment, but destined to echo across more than 2,000 years of retelling. As Leonidas moves among his remaining soldiers in these final hours before dawn breaks fully, one of his men, according to the story passed down through Herodotus and other ancient writers, remarks with evident unease about the sheer number of Persian archers gathering on the horizon. So many, he observes, that their arrows will surely blot out the sun itself when the fighting resumes. Leonidas's response, delivered according to legend with an almost casual dryness that somehow perfectly captures the entire Spartan temperament in a single sentence, "Is this, then, we will fight in the shade?" Here's the mainstream historical fact worth sitting with, because this exchange has survived for over 2,000 years, specifically because it captures something genuinely remarkable about the psychology of these men in their final hours. It isn't bravado exactly, and it isn't denial either. It's something closer to grim practical humor, deployed deliberately, in the way that soldiers throughout history have often used dark jokes to steady themselves and each other in moments when fear would otherwise take over completely. Whether Leonidas actually said these exact words in this exact moment is something historians still debate, since Herodotus was writing decades after these events based on second-hand accounts and oral tradition. But the line has endured precisely because it feels true to everything else we know about how these men carried themselves. Here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that adds an even stranger layer to this famous morning. According to some ancient accounts, when Leonidas addresses his remaining soldiers directly before the final engagement, he doesn't deliver some grand, rousing speech about glory or honor or the fate of Greece resting on their shoulders. Instead, several sources suggest his instructions were almost eerily practical and specific, telling his men, according to one account, to eat a hearty breakfast, because tonight, he reportedly tells them with characteristic bluntness, they would be dining in the underworld. It's a genuinely strange thing to say to men in their final hours, and yet it captures something essential about Spartan culture that outsiders throughout history have often struggled to fully understand. Death for these men wasn't something to be avoided through denial or softened through elaborate speeches about legacy and honor. It was simply the next fact of the day, to be met with the same unbothered practicality as any other piece of information relevant to how the morning would unfold. Eat well. The fighting will be hard. Tonight you'll be somewhere else entirely. Here's your dry observation for the evening, offered gently, because there's something almost unbearably tender hiding underneath the grim humor of this entire morning. Imagine being handed a joke about arrows blotting out the sun and a suggestion to eat a good breakfast because dinner would be taken somewhere else entirely, and understanding with complete clarity that both statements are being offered not to frighten you but to comfort you in the only language these particular men fully knew how to speak. As the last grey light of dawn gives way fully to morning, and the sound of Persian war horns begins echoing down from beyond the pass, signaling that the main army is once again advancing toward the Greek position. Leonidas gathers his remaining soldiers into formation one final time, but something has shifted in how they're about to fight. Rather than holding their position behind the reinforced wall the way they had throughout the previous day's engagements, Leonidas makes a decision that surprises even some of his own men, ordering the Spartans and their remaining allies to advance forward out into the open ground beyond the pass toward the Persian army itself. The order to advance ripples through the remaining Greek ranks, and for a moment, even among soldiers who have spent their entire lives absorbing Spartan discipline, without question there's a flicker of genuine surprise. Throughout the previous day, the entire strategic logic of this battle had depended on staying behind that reinforced wall, using the narrow terrain and fixed defensive position to neutralize Persia's overwhelming numbers. Now, with the end of everything clearly in sight, Leonidas orders his men to do the opposite. Move forward, out into the wider stretch of the pass beyond the protective bottleneck that had served them so well. Here's what you need to understand about why this decision makes a strange, brutal kind of sense once you sit with it. With the mountain path compromised and the immortals already descending toward their rear, the reinforced wall and narrow choke point that had protected them for a full day of fighting are no longer going to matter in the way they once did. Within hours, this position will be surrounded regardless of what formation the Greeks maintain. So, rather than wait passively behind a wall for that encirclement to complete itself, Leonidas makes the choice to spend whatever time and strength his remaining soldiers have left, doing the maximum possible damage to the army in front of them in the widest, most exposed ground available, where more of his soldiers can engage the enemy simultaneously rather than being funneled through the narrowest point of the pass. It's worth pausing on what this actually means in practical terms, because it reframes something important about how these final hours unfold. This isn't a desperate last stand fought purely out of stubborn refusal to retreat. It's a final tactical decision made with the same clear-eyed calculation Leonidas had shown throughout this entire campaign, to inflict as much damage as possible in the time remaining, understanding that the outcome for his own men is no longer in question, but the outcome for Persia's overall campaign might still be shaped by exactly how costly this final morning becomes. The Persian army advancing once again into the pass, expecting to resume the same grinding, attritional fighting from the previous day, instead finds the Greek line moving toward them out beyond the shelter of that reinforced wall into ground, where the phalanx has room to spread wider and engage a larger portion of the advancing Persian force all at once. And here is where the fighting takes on a different character entirely from the disciplined defensive engagements of the day before. Ancient sources describe this final battle in genuinely striking terms, a level of ferocity that goes beyond even the brutal fighting of the previous day. The Spartans and their remaining Thespian allies fight with what Herodotus describes as reckless disregard for their own survival, spears breaking in the crush of bodies, soldiers fighting on even after their weapons had shattered, continuing the fight with short swords, and when those broke or were lost according to some accounts, with their bare hands and even their teeth when nothing else remained. It's a detail almost difficult to process fully, the image of men fighting past the point where any weapon remains, driven by something that has moved beyond tactical calculation entirely into something closer to pure, desperate defiance. Here's the mainstream historical fact that captures the scale of what's happening in this final engagement. Even fighting with everything they have left, the vastly outnumbered Greek force manages to inflict what ancient sources describe as staggering casualties among the advancing Persian ranks, a final, brutal accounting that seems almost disproportionate given how few defenders remain to inflict it. Whatever else this final stand accomplishes, it does not go quietly, and it does not go cheaply for the army pressing against it. Here's the quirky, lesser-known detail buried inside this ferocious final engagement, one that adds a strange, almost eerie texture to the ancient accounts. Herodotus specifically records that Xerxes' own brothers, among the many members of the extended Persian royal family present with the army, are killed during this fighting, a detail that underscores just how close and personal this final engagement had become. No longer simply regular soldiers and elite immortals clashing in the pass, but members of the Persian king's own family now falling within sight of his command platform. Here's your dry observation for tonight, offered carefully given the weight of what's unfolding. Because there's something almost unbearable about watching men fight this hard, this ferociously, with absolutely no illusion left about how the morning will end. It isn't hope driving this fighting anymore. Hope had already been set aside sometime during the previous night's council, when Leonidas made the decision to send the bulk of his army south to safety. What remains now is something rawer and, in its own brutal way, more remarkable, men choosing to spend every last measure of their strength and skill on making this final morning as costly as humanly possible for the empire that came to erase them. And it's in the middle of this chaotic, desperate fighting, spears, shattered formations breaking down into something closer to individual combat than organized warfare, that Leonidas himself, the king who chose this ground, selected these men and made the final call to stand and fight rather than retreat is struck down. And the battle around his body is about to become one of the most fiercely contested moments of the entire war. The moment Leonidas falls, something shifts in the chaos of the battlefield, a change that ripples outward through both the Greek and Persian ranks almost instantly, even amid the deafening noise and confusion of close combat. Ancient sources don't specify the exact instant of his death with much precision, an understandable gap given the sheer chaos of hand-to-hand fighting in a crush of bodies this dense. But they're unified on what happens immediately afterward, and it's one of the more remarkable details of this entire battle. Here's what you need to understand about why Leonidas's death triggers what happens next, because it reveals something important about how deeply ancient warfare was bound up in symbolism and honor in ways that can feel genuinely foreign to modern sensibilities. In the ancient Greek world, the body of a fallen leader carried enormous symbolic weight. Recovering a king's body and preventing it from falling into enemy hands wasn't simply a matter of sentiment or ceremony. It was considered a sacred obligation, a final act of loyalty that soldiers owed their commander even after his death, and conversely, capturing or desecrating an enemy leader's body was viewed as a profound insult, a way of extending the humiliation of defeat beyond the battlefield itself. So when Leonidas falls, the fighting around his body doesn't slow or pause out of respect. It intensifies dramatically into what ancient writers describe as some of the fiercest close combat of the entire engagement. Herodotus specifically records that a brutal struggle erupts over Leonidas's corpse, with Greek soldiers fighting desperately to retrieve and protect his body from Persian hands, while Persian soldiers, aware of exactly how symbolically significant capturing an enemy king's body would be, push with equal desperation to seize it. Here's the mainstream historical fact that captures the scale of this struggle. According to ancient accounts, the fighting over Leonidas's body becomes so intense and so costly that it happens not once but multiple times throughout the remainder of this final engagement. The Greeks managing to reclaim his body from Persian hands on more than one occasion, only for the fighting to surge back over the same contested ground again as Persian forces continue pressing to seize it. It's a detail that tells you something genuinely remarkable about the emotional and symbolic stakes still driving these exhausted, badly outnumbered Greek soldiers even after their king has fallen. Whatever hope of survival had already been abandoned. Protecting Leonidas's body in death becomes, in these final chaotic minutes, its own fiercely contested battle within the larger battle. Here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that adds an almost tragic irony to this specific moment. Some ancient accounts suggest that in the desperate scramble to protect their fallen king's body, a number of Greek soldiers, who might otherwise have continued fighting in the wider engagement, instead diverted their remaining strength, specifically toward this single symbolic task, meaning that at least some Spartan and Thespian lives in these final minutes, were spent not on inflicting further casualties against the broader Persian advance, but on an act of loyalty and honor toward a man who was already gone. Historians still debate whether this was, in the coldest tactical sense, the most effective use of the little strength these soldiers had left, or whether the emotional and cultural weight of protecting their king's body simply mattered more in that moment than any remaining tactical calculation. Here's your dry observation for tonight, offered with real gentleness, given what's unfolding, because there's something almost unbearably human buried inside this grim tug of war over a fallen king's body. Even stripped of every illusion about survival, even fighting past the point where weapons themselves had broken and splintered in their hands, these men still found something worth fighting fiercely for beyond their own lives, a final act of devotion to a commander who had, in his own quiet way, spent this entire campaign trying to protect them right up until the moment. Protection was no longer something he could offer. Ultimately, according to Herodotus's account, the Greeks do succeed in recovering and holding Leonidas's body through this brutal struggle, a small, hard-won victory salvaged from an otherwise catastrophic morning. But the cost of this repeated fighting over his corpse, combined with the relentless, grinding pressure of the main Persian advance, continuing to press against what remains of the Greek line, leaves the surviving defenders in an increasingly desperate position. Their numbers, already devastatingly thin after a full day and a half of continuous fighting, continue to shrink with every passing minute, and the Persian forces, having finally located and closed off every possible avenue of retreat, now begin tightening what remains of their encirclement around the last of the Greek defenders. What follows as the surviving Spartans and their remaining allies find themselves pressed backward under overwhelming pressure from every direction at once will become the single most iconic image associated with this entire battle. A small, doomed group of men making their absolute final stand atop a modest rise of ground, armed with nothing more than broken weapons and whatever fury remains in men who have already accepted completely and without illusion that this hill is the last piece of ground they will ever stand on. The hill itself is unremarkable, in almost every way a modest rise of rocky ground near the narrowest point of the pass, the kind of terrain feature that under any other circumstances wouldn't warrant a second glance from anyone passing through this stretch of coastline. But it's here, on this small, otherwise forgettable elevation, that the last of the Greek defenders make their final stand, pressed backward, step by step, as Persian forces close in from every remaining direction at once. Here's what you need to understand about how completely the tactical situation has collapsed by this point. With the mountain path compromised and the immortals now fully deployed behind the Greek position, and with the main Persian army continuing its relentless frontal pressure, the surviving Spartans and Thespians find themselves genuinely surrounded. For the first time in this entire engagement, no longer fighting from the relative safety of a defended choke point, but forced backward onto this small rise of ground, where retreat in any direction simply isn't an option anymore. Picture the scene as it must have looked in these final minutes, because ancient sources, despite writing decades after the events themselves, describe this moment with striking, almost cinematic detail. Spears, the primary weapon that had served these soldiers so effectively throughout the previous day and a half of fighting, are almost universally shattered or lost by this point, broken in the brutal repeated crush of close combat. Herodotus specifically records that the surviving defenders continued fighting with whatever weapons remained available to them. Short swords when they had them, and when even those failed or were lost or broken, according to the account, with their bare hands and their teeth, a level of desperate, physical defiance that goes beyond conventional warfare into something closer to raw animal refusal to simply lie down and accept the ending being forced upon them. Here's the mainstream historical fact, anchoring this final phase of the battle, and it's worth sitting with the sheer scale of what Xerxes ultimately has to commit to finish off this small remaining group. Rather than continuing to send infantry into close combat against soldiers who have already demonstrated repeatedly and at enormous cost. Just how effectively they can fight, even when hopelessly outnumbered Persian commanders eventually make the decision to simply surround the hill entirely and unleash a sustained volley of arrows and other ranged weapons, overwhelming the Scots' last defenders not through direct combat but through sheer the volume of projectiles raining down from every direction at once. Here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that adds a genuinely strange layer of intrigue to how this final moment actually played out, one that historians still debate to this day. Archaeological excavations conducted at Thermopylae in the mid-20th century uncovered a substantial number of Persian arrowheads concentrated specifically on this small hill. Physical evidence that lines up remarkably well with Herodotus's account of the defenders being finished off primarily through archery rather than close combat in these absolute final moments. It's a rare case where the physical remains of the ancient world directly corroborate a detail from a written account composed decades after the events it describes. And it's given modern historians considerably more confidence in the overall reliability of Herodotus's version of this final stand, even as they continue debating other less physically verifiable aspects of his broader narrative. Here's your moment of dry observation for tonight, offered with real care given the weight of what's happening, because there's something almost unbearably stark about how this specific battle actually ends. After a day and a half of ferocious close combat spears and shields and desperate hand-to-hand fighting, the empire that commands the largest army the ancient world has ever assembled ultimately finishes off its smallest, most stubborn obstacle, not through any dramatic final clash, but simply by stepping back and letting distance and overwhelming numbers of arrows do what direct combat had repeatedly, embarrassingly failed to accomplish. As the arrows finally fall silent and the small hill grows quiet, the Battle of Thermopylae in the most immediate and literal sense is over. Every one of the remaining defenders, the last of the 300 Spartans, the 700 Thespians who chose loyalty over survival, all of them lie dead on this modest rise of ground overlooking the pass and the sea beyond it. It's a devastating, total loss in the most obvious immediate military sense. 3 days of fighting, ending with every single defender who chose to stay behind now gone. And yet in a way that neither the exhausted Persian soldiers standing over that hill, nor Xerxes himself watching from his platform, could have fully appreciated in this exact moment. The true consequences of what just happened at Thermopylae are only beginning to take shape, because word of this stand is already travelling south ahead of the advancing Persian army, reaching Greek cities and rallying points where it will do something that Xerxes almost certainly never anticipated when he finally cleared this small, stubborn obstacle from his path. News of what happened at Thermopylae moves south faster than the Persian army itself, carried by survivors from the retreating Greek contingents, by refugees, by the kind of urgent, half-formed rumor that spreads through a frightened population faster than any official messenger could manage. And here is what you need to understand about why this matters so enormously, because on the surface, judged purely by the immediate military outcome, Thermopylae looks like an unambiguous Persian victory. The pass has fallen. Every defender who chose to stay behind is dead. Xerxes' army, delayed but ultimately unstopped, continues its advance into central Greece exactly as planned. And yet the story that spread south isn't a story of Persian triumph. It's a story of something else entirely, and Greek cities that had been wavering, uncertain whether resistance against an empire this size was even worth attempting, begin hearing a very different message carried in the accounts of what those 300 Spartans and their allies actually accomplished. Historians still debate exactly how much of this shift in Greek morale can be attributed directly to Thermopylae itself versus other factors already in motion, but the timing is difficult to dismiss entirely as coincidence. Here's the mainstream historical fact that matters most in understanding the true legacy of this battle. Just weeks later, the combined Greek fleet meets the Persian navy at Salamis, a narrow strait where once again Greek forces used constrained geography to neutralize Persian numerical superiority, and this time The result is a decisive Greek victory that fundamentally cripples Xerxes' ability to sustain his invasion. The following year, Greek land forces defeat the remaining Persian army at Plataea, effectively ending the invasion entirely and securing Greek independence for generations to come. None of that happens in a vacuum. The alliance that held together long enough to win at Salamis and Plataea was the same fragile, quarrelsome coalition of city-states that Thermopylae had helped bind together through demonstrated proof that Persia, for all its overwhelming scale, could in fact be resisted, could in fact be made to bleed, could in fact be delayed. Here's the quirky, lesser-known detail that closes this story in a way that feels almost deliberately poetic, whether or not the ancient world intended it that way. In the years following the war, the Greeks erected a monument at Thermopylae itself, marking the site where the last defenders fell, and inscribed upon it were words attributed to the poet Simonides, a brief epitaph written for the fallen Spartans specifically. The inscription, translated across more than 2,000 years of retelling, asks a passerby to tell the people of Sparta that here, obedient to their laws, these men lie. It's a strange, understated way to memorialize what happened on that hill. No grand claims of victory, no elaborate praise, simply a quiet statement about duty, fulfilled to the very end. And here's your final dry observation for tonight, offered gently, because there's something worth sitting with in how differently this battle reads, depending on which moment you choose to freeze it at. Frozen at the fall of that final hill, it's an unambiguous defeat. 300 Spartans and their allies wiped out entirely, the pass lost, the invasion continuing unimpeded. But frozen a year later, watching Persian forces withdraw permanently from Greek soil, after Plataea, it becomes something else entirely. One of the opening moves in an improbable defense that changed the trajectory of Greek civilization, by extension, changed quite a lot about the world that followed it. Historians continue debating even now exactly how much practical military benefit Thermopylae actually provided, whether the delay it purchased for the rest of Greece was strategically decisive or simply symbolically powerful, a story that mattered more for what it proved about Greek resolve than for any measurable tactical advantage it delivered. But even the most skeptical modern assessments tend to agree on one thing. Something about watching a vastly outnumbered force choose to stand and fight rather than retreat or surrender resonated through the ancient world in a way that pure military calculation doesn't fully explain. Leonidas never saw any of what came after. He never knew about Salamis, never knew about Plataea, never knew that the prophecy he seems to have quietly accepted back at Delphi, that either Sparta would fall or a king of the line of Heracles would die, would resolve itself in his own death in a way that ultimately helped ensure Sparta never fell at all. He simply made a series of choices, methodical and clear-eyed, rather than dramatic, choosing his 300 men for reasons rooted in bloodline preservation rather than individual glory, choosing this specific stretch of coastline for reasons rooted in cold geographic calculation, and finally choosing when the mountain path was compromised and retreat was still technically possible to stay anyway. That choice, more than any single tactical detail of the fighting itself, is what the ancient world remembered and what continued to be remembered for the more than 2,000 years since. Not because it changed the immediate outcome of a single battle in central Greece, but because it demonstrated something that apparently needed demonstrating. That overwhelming force does not automatically guarantee submission, that a narrow strip of ground between mountain and sea can, in the right hands, become something far more consequential than its size would ever suggest. The pass at Thermopylae is quiet again now, and has been for a very long time. The sea along that ancient coastline has gone still and dark, the way it always does once the last light fades from the sky, and if you listen closely enough in your own mind, you can almost hear how quiet that narrow strip of shore has become after all these centuries. The hot springs still bubble somewhere in the rock, soft and slow, the same sound they made on that final morning, indifferent to everything that happened around them. The mountain path above the pass has long since grown over oak leaves, settling year after year across ground that once carried the weight of an army moving through darkness. The old stone wall has crumbled further, still softened by rain and time, into something closer to a gentle ridge in the landscape than a fortification. Wildflowers grow there now in the warmer months, scattered loosely across a hillside that once held nothing but broken spears. Whatever fear, whatever fury, whatever quiet, aching love those men carried in their final hours has long since settled into something calmer, folded gently into the stillness of the stone that remembers them. The prophecy is fulfilled. The king is at rest. The sea keeps its old, slow rhythm against the shore, patient and unhurried the way it always has. You can let that stillness settle over you now too, the way it settled over that quiet hillside so long ago. There is nothing left to defend tonight, nothing left to carry. The past has finished asking anything of you. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders soften into wherever you're resting, and let the ancient world drift gently back into its long, undisturbed sleep. The world is quiet. It is time for deep sleep.